young man over in the Chester area who's been going through a lot of medical problems this year. And they not out of the woods by any means by this point, but if you could keep Derek Nash in your prayers, it would be a really good thing. For the last couple of weeks, actually for about a month now, we've been talking about the church and our relationship to the church. We started 4 weeks ago, talking about our attitude towards the church and how our attitude spawns all of our actions from there. That not only do we need to be doctrinally correct, but also we need to be emotionally or mentally correct as well. That both our doctrine and our action should go hand in hand together. We talked then about our relationship with the church, how it's not a country club or it's not a social function that we join, but it's something that God adds us to, and via that we have a lot of relationships, and that's what we talked about last week, was our responsibilities that go along with that. And this week we want to kind of end this mini-series by talking about our work in the church. That each one of us has a responsibility not only towards one another of love and of good works and efforts, but a work towards the church, that we are striving for something together. And in that, each one of us has our own role and our own responsibility to fulfill. That what we do here on Sundays is worship, and what we do on Wednesday nights is Bible study. The work of the church goes beyond these four walls, and it goes beyond maybe an individual or a couple individuals. The work of the church is produced by the collective whole. And here in Colossians chapter 1 is where we want to begin. There in Colossians chapter 1, let's begin there in verse 9. As Paul is writing to a group that he has not been with, he says, "And so from the day that we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and the spiritual wisdom and understanding, so to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God." He asks there, read there in verse 11, "May you be strengthened with all power, according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy." Paul is describing here in these few verses that he wants them to be busy, and in a very particular way. He says that their busyness or their work is going to be dependent on their knowledge of God's will. And then here in verse 10, he says that he asks that individually that we live up to a manner that is worthy of God's calling. This is an often repeated phrase from Paul, is that we do what we can do to live in a manner worthy of God. And that's a really tall order. But personal faithfulness is kind of a predicate for us being able to do further work. And so then he says in verse 10 that we would be bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in our knowledge of God. That if we have a knowledge for God and we have a love and a zeal for him, then fruit is going to be the natural result of that. And he says it's going to be every good work. And then he says here in verse 11 that once we are kind of ingrained in that, once we are doing that, that we may be strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, along with endurance and patience and joy. All of those are key elements of the recipe for us to be fruitful workers in God's kingdom. We're going to keep our fingers there in Colossians for just a second and turn over to Titus chapter 2. Paul mentions good works here in Titus chapter 2, and he phrases them this way. If you go back to Titus chapter 2, there in verse 14. Titus chapter 2 and verse 14, he says, speaking of Jesus, there in verse 13 and verse 14 says, "Who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works." And the good works that Paul is writing to Titus about, especially here in chapter 2 and chapter 3, is not merely attendance. It's not just showing up. It's not just singing songs or taking in the Lord's Supper. The good works are not the worship service acts. They are the good works that we as Christians are to do all of the time. They are the daily ideas that he gives earlier on in verses 1 through verse 10. To be individuals who are to teach what is good and to be reverent in behavior, to be steadfast and to be submissive to one another. That we are to be well-pleasing and not argumentative, just picking a few things out from the previous verses. that we are the individuals who are currently working in God's kingdom. And in that work, we are to be zealous. And he phrases it this way in verse 14, that Jesus gave himself for the express purpose of purchasing for himself a people who are zealous for good works. Not people who he has to drag along and he has to coerce, there we go. We're going to get words out eventually today. To coerce them into doing what he wants them to do. But people who are zealous. And then following that progression down into chapter 3, he asks Titus to remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, and then to be ready for every good work. Most 16-year-olds are rather zealous for driving. Doesn't mean that they're really ready for driving. And so while God has purchased us for the purpose of being zealous for good works, he also reminds us to gain the things that we need to gain in order to be ready for good works. And then in chapter 3 and verse 8, he says there at the very end of verse 8 that we are to be careful to devote ourselves to good works. That once we are zealous and we are ready to devote ourselves to those things. And so we kind of step back and we ask ourselves, have I been producing fruit, as we've looked at there in Colossians chapter 1 verse 10, and have I been producing the good works that God has asked me to in his kingdom? Am I someone who is fruitful in these things, or am I the person that now we're looking at springtime and we're looking at all the plants come up, I don't know if that one's going to make it. I know Brittany's been going through her seeding process, and we get the little sprouts that come up, and then she has to make the decision, is this one going to make it or not? And pretty soon it's, nope, not going to make it. And then a really small salad comes up. But that's the idea as we look here. Are we fruitful? Are we producing something? And the producing is not the idea of just showing up or being attentive, but is actually doing something for God's kingdom. And I can't do that for you, and you can't do that for me. That your fruitfulness is wholly and completely your work. And my fruitfulness is completely and wholly my work. Well, I can encourage you, and you can encourage me, and we can stir one another up to love and good works, which is our responsibility we talked about last week. As much as that is my responsibility to help you, I can't be fruitful for you. I can't be so fruitful that I can give you some of my fruits. God is asking you to live in a manner worthy of his calling, and for you to produce fruit and to be busy in those areas. And sometimes, as we look over here in Galatians chapter 5, Paul phrases it in this way. He has an interesting way of looking at it. As we looked at before, the fruits of the Spirit are there, verses 22 down to verse 24. And then he says here, according to those fruits that we are to be bearing, there in verse 25, he says, if we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit. Now, we'll be looking here in a few moments into the military terms that are used for us driving side by side and being good soldiers. And he's almost using that similar wording here in chapter 5, that we keep in step. It's the idea of marching in rank with the Spirit, that we are on the same board, on the same side, on the same team. And it's not someone who has to be dragged along for those things, but someone who is actively participating and being fruitful in the Spirit. So when we think of our relationship with the church, sometimes we view it solely in terms of our relationship, that we have a good attitude towards it, or we have a good friendship with those in the church. Sometimes we view of the responsibility of showing love towards one another, but sometimes do we think of our work in the church as something that I have to do on a regular basis, that I have to keep in step with those things. And on a very semi-regular basis, we need to examine ourselves and ask, are we being fruitful in those things? Are we multiplying those things? Or are we just kind of so-so? Over in Philippians chapter 1, we mentioned there in Colossians, there in verse 10, he encouraged us to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. He uses a very similar phrase in Philippians chapter 1. In Philippians chapter 1, there in verse 27, has often been described as being the thesis statement of Philippians. But he says there in verse 27, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. So whether I come and I see you, or I am absent, I may hear that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. not frightened in anything by your opponents, this is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation that is from God. He encourages them in verse 27 again, as he encouraged the Colossians, to walk in a manner worthy of the gospel. But notice what he says there, according to their work at the end of verse 27, that they are standing firm, striving side by side for the gospel. We have a goal to spread the news as far as wide as we can. But there are so many people here in the Williamsburg area who need to hear about God's saving grace. There's people all over who are buying self-help books, that they're looking at all kinds of means in order to gain them the things that they know instinctively that they're missing in their life. And we are there to send out the message that we have what's missing in their life. And what he says here in verse 27 is not for Paul writing to the individual who is working there in Philippi, say, well, you need to go out and you need to do this. He's writing to the collective group and says, you need to stand side by side and strive side by side for the gospel. There's a reason, as you go over Luke chapter 10, and Jesus sends out the 70 out into the area to spread the gospel. They're going to town and to preach the good news. He sends them out 2 by 2. There's a really good reason for that. There's a reason when Paul left on his first missionary journey, he didn't just go by himself. And Paul is a really strong person. But he took Barnabas with him. And then whenever Barnabas was, him and Barnabas had that contention, they decided not to go together, Paul still took Timothy and Titus and then Luke. There's a reason that you never find Paul more or less by himself. And then even at the end where he seems pretty much by himself in 2 Timothy chapter 4, he asks that John Mark come and be with him. Really good reasons for that. And so here in Philippians, he encourages us to stand side by side and strive for the gospel as a part of our work. And sometimes we get really discouraged very quickly by individuals going out and trying to offer invitations or have Bible studies, and we get burnt out really quickly. We think, well, there's just no one here who's going to do the work that and we just get so tired of doing good so quickly. And so Paul writes to the Philippians, who notably are in a very hard area. The ground is not a fertile ground, so to speak. And he's encouraging them to stand firm, strive side by side for the gospel. And so as you think of your work here in Williamsburg, have you been taking time to strive alongside somebody else in their work? Turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. We'll read verses 10 down through verse 15. The big discussion has been coming here over which speaker they like better. Some like Paul, some like Peter, some like Apollos in chapter 1. And he makes the point here at the beginning of chapter 3 that Paul is nothing, and Apollos is nothing, and Peter is nothing, only God. He's the only one that really matters. And then he gets into the discussion of building upon God's church, that Paul and Apollos are both workers who are building upon the foundation that Jesus has laid. And he says here in verse 10 that according to the grace of God that is given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else built upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it. Now, notice what he says there in verse 10. He doesn't say, well, take care that whenever Apollos builds upon it, or whenever Peter builds upon it. He says, well, take care when each one builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which has already been laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds upon the foundation with gold or silver or precious stone or wood or hay or straw, that each one's work will become manifest in the day that will be disclosed, because it will become revealed by fire. And the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has done or has built upon the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only through fire. Notice how he keeps on putting the work that is being done on a universal scale and an individual basis, that each one needs to take care as he builds upon it. and that each individual's work will be judged. And each work that each person will do, it keeps putting it both as everybody and as everyone individually. And when it comes to the spread of the gospel and the work in the community there in Corinth, Paul didn't single out Apollos, and he didn't single out Peter, and he didn't take all the claim for himself whenever I go out and I build upon it. He's asking the whole group to be working for the same goal of building upon this foundation that Paul has laid. That's a really key component when it comes to what we are to be doing here as the congregation. We also need to remember as a side note, James chapter 3 and verse 1, where James makes the point, let not many of us become teachers, for they will receive the stricter judgment. Now, the question comes up, how do we balance 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where we each are to lay a foundation, or lay upon the foundation, and James chapter 3, not all of us should become teachers. Now, what I think that James is teaching there, and he's driving at, is the profession of a teacher. Not that each individual doesn't have the responsibility to teach. Meaning that if you get to shine your light, if you get to teach your neighbor, if you get to bring up the discussion, or to have them dig further in the gospel, that isn't what James is teaching in James chapter 3 and verse 1. What Paul is talking about there is not the idea that everyone needs to go out and start their own congregation. Everyone has to become a professional teacher. Those are two separate discussions between James and 1 Corinthians chapter 3. But what Paul is dealing with is what each individual does. There are people that you know in your life that you get to interact with on a regular basis, who you have an example with, that you have a reputation with, that I don't know. And that's fine. But what that means is that you have a responsibility of a work that isn't necessarily mine, and vice versa. That there are people in my life that you may never get to interact with. But that means that it's my responsibility, my work, in order to shine God's light into that area. And so what Paul is dealing with here in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 is that same idea. That the group there at Corinth, whether they're small or big, whether it's one family or 15 different families, that one individual does not have the influence or the work capability that the entire group has. And so he's encouraging them as individuals to go out and to work in God's kingdom. And for our last passage is there in Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4, begin with me there in verse 11. He has been dealing here at the beginning of chapter 4 of the unity that's in God. Both the Jews and the Gentiles have been, from the beginning of the world, planned to be one in Christ. And he then mentions here that there is one body, one spirit, to which you have been called, to the one hope that belongs to your call. The one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father who is over all and in you all and through all. And then he mentions here of the diversity that God has planned inside of that oneness. And what he says here in verse 11, that he gave the apostles and the prophets and the evangelists and the shepherds and the teachers. There's diversity, not meaning that they're different in spirit or different in mentality, but they're different in ability. And he gave them there in verse 11 for the purpose in verse 12 to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. Notice how he phrases there in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 12. He didn't give them to do the work of the ministry. While they all still have their own individual work, he gave them to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ, until we all obtain the unity of faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, so we may no longer be children who are tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, and by human cunning, and by craftiness and deceitful scheme. Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. For the body to work properly, I need to be doing my part. And that's the point that he makes there in verse 16. That the body is fully equipped when each part is working properly. The body grows up whenever each part is doing what's needed. And Paul obviously gives the analogy over in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 of how we feel about our individual part of Christ's body. That there are some who, by their nature, can have a feeling of, well, because I am so great, other parts are not necessary. And Paul reins them in and says, well, that's not the case. There is no one person that is so great that other people are unnecessary. And then there's the people who feel that they, because they do not have a certain function or a certain job or a certain preeminence, well, they're just not that important. And Paul says, well, you need to realize that Christ has placed you there. God has put you in that purpose, in that place, for the purpose of you fulfilling your function. As you look at your body, what parts do you say, well, I just really could use less of, minus the insulation that we have? So how many times have we thought, man, I just really don't like my left arm? Or my pinky toe is really not that important. Or my liver, I cannot see the purpose of my liver. We don't do that. And yet so oftentimes when it comes to either ourselves or others, we think, well, maybe their work isn't nearly as important. Or maybe my work isn't nearly as important. And Paul, through inspiration of the Spirit, tells us repeatedly that your work is important. For the work here at Williamsburg work to succeed, everyone needs to have their job and have it working properly. That he has given them a variety of gifts here in verse 11 to equip the saints for the work in the ministry. That we need to strive, as Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 1, side by side for the gospel. And we need to keep on producing fruits to have a life that is worthy of the gospel. Be equipped for every good work. And so we've been ending the last couple lessons with a series of questions, and I have a short series of questions for you today. When you look back at what's been happening in the last 3 months in your life, have you been bearing fruit for every good work in the last 3 months? Or have you been kind of slacking? Do you view it as your work in God's church to strive side by side with others in the gospel? Or do you view that as someone else's job? And just speaking personally and very frankly, whenever I get to go out and I get to have Bible studies with individuals or out on Chick-fil-A, it makes the world a difference when there is somebody there. Even if you say, well, I don't have the knowledge or I don't have the courage, if just to sit there and sometimes not even be talkative makes a world of difference for the person that you're working with. Just having a companion, even if you feel like being silent, makes a huge difference. And so Paul encourages the Philippians, if the question comes up, have you viewed it as your work to strive side by side with somebody? I'm not necessarily meaning me, but somebody else. I know that there are other Bible studies happening on a weekly basis, or at least a bi-weekly basis. Have you considered calling them up and asking if you can join in? And even if you just want to be silent, or make a comment or two, that would make a world difference for them. Have you been doing your best to build upon God's foundation in the last 6 months? And obviously the time frames, again, are completely arbitrary, but it just gives us a perspective. We sometimes think, well, of course I am, because, and then we realize that it's been 3 years ago that we did something. So for the time frame, in the last 6 months, have you earnestly extended an invitation to somebody, and then maybe bugged them about it, and then asked them again whenever they said, well, no, thank you, not today. Or, this Sunday would be just inconvenient. Our family is going away on vacation. In the last 6 months, have you been doing that? And for the last question, do you view your work in the church as essential for the proper working of this congregation? Because we read the passages over in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 a lot. We read Ephesians chapter 4. I know I've been through Ephesians chapter 4 several times in the last 2 years. But reading it and then really just envisioning that for yourself, do you believe that you are essential for the work? Because Paul doesn't say in Ephesians chapter 4, when some of the parts or most of the parts are working properly. But he says when all of the parts are working properly, it builds itself up in love. And so do you really view yourself as being essential to the work here? Because if not, reread Ephesians chapter 4. Reread 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Understand that God has granted you with gifts and abilities that he has not granted to everybody else. That he has given you your unique personality and your relationships that are a bit closer with other people that not everybody has. He has given you the ways to encourage and to uplift and to rebuke sometimes in ways that other people can't. Take some time and to really view yourself as God views you, as essential for the work here. And take some time this week as my challenge is to ask yourself, what work have you been doing? And we can't, there is no certain quantity. We'd say, okay, I've done X amount of good things, so therefore I can put my seal and say, I'm done for this month. But if we don't have any fruits, if we can't put our finger on anything we've done recently, then we may really want to consider what our relationship with the church is. Dennis has picked out number 835. There are so many blessings that come with being in the church. And the process for becoming a Christian is rather simple, though it takes a whole lot of humility. To submit fully to God's will and to give up yours for his. And sometimes we become prideful and we become arrogant in our lives. And we stray off back into sin. And if that's the case, coming back is surprisingly easy, if not with a whole lot of humility. God always stands with open arms, willing to accept his people. But you have to make the choice to make that change. And there's really no better time than the present. If you hear the invitation, you think, well, that may apply to me, then it probably does. And if we can help you to do that this morning, to make the change, to be encouraging to you, please let us know as we stand and sing number 835.
There's a fountain free, 'tis for you and me. Let us hasten, haste to its spring. 'Tis a fount of love from the source above, and he bids us all freely drink. Will you come? You come.